I feel like this one could get me in hot water. I'm anticipating some response videos, which is cool. You know, it's always interesting to hear what people with a different perspective have to say about what I think, but I think that a few responses will probably be big mad. So looking forward to that. Anyway, let's talk about sociology. Sociologists and scholars of religious studies often utilize what's called the 3B framework of religion and religious identity formation. The 3 Bs stand for beliefs, behavior, and belonging. The belief dimension consists of ideas about theology, philosophy, ethics, cosmology, etc., held within a religion. The behavior dimension consists of actions which religious individuals and groups take, such as rituals, rites, daily devotional practices, prayer, holidays, etc. Belonging refers to an individual's sense of membership or belonging to a group or identity. Here in the Protestant Christian-dominated US, we often think of religion primarily as a set of beliefs, and that any religious behavior or belonging must spring from that. This can be seen in the way we often refer to religious people, as believers. Even in the case of Protestant Christianity, though, that is overly simplistic. Behavior like church attendance is obviously important for many, but I'd argue that extremely popular and socially enforced behaviors like getting married, being monogamous, and having kids are just as integral to that identity. Identifying as Christian and affiliating with Christian-aligned groups is popular, even for those who may not belong to a formal congregation. Many find a sense of belonging among Christians and identify themselves as such, even if they know or care little about Christian doctrine. Christianity is not just a matter of belief, it's a matter of behavior as well as belonging. In fact, I'd argue that this belonging and behavior are not a product of belief, but that belonging and behavior, for most people, actually precede belief. I think this is true of religion in general, but I'll speak in terms of Christianity here. If you'd like to see a scholar of religious studies discuss this in terms of religion more broadly, you'll find a link to a video by Religion for Breakfast in the description. So why think that Christian belief springs from behavior and belonging? Here are a few reasons. Most Christians were brought up as Christians from a young age, engaging in rituals like prayer and worship, as well as feeling a sense of belonging in a Christian group and household well before reaching an age where they could comprehend the doctrine Christians believe. Many Christians, whether lay people or esteemed philosophers, profess that their belief is rooted in their own spiritual experiences, most of which were brought on by religious behavior, like intense prayer, worship, and other rituals. In Christian culture and education, apologetics, or just reasons to believe Christianity in the first place, are most often presented to people after they already consider themselves Christians. If belief stems from behavior and belonging, then what does this tell us about arguments for God and other Christian beliefs? Such arguments serve to reinforce pre-existing belief, and for most Christians, interact fairly little with behavior and belonging. Discussing these arguments is not necessary or culturally expected behavior for Christians, and they don't provide a sense of belonging for most. This is why most Christians don't really know or care about them. They only serve to prop up belief, but belief, for most, is already propped up by behavior and belonging, so they offer relatively little utility for most. In this way, such arguments are not important to Christian faith. Why then do a minority of Christians speak about them so much? I do think these arguments provide utility to these Christians, but not in the way or degree that you might think. Apologetics, reasons and arguments for the faith, are nearly always utilized responsively. Interest in apologetics usually begins as a response to doubt, whether the doubt of others or one's own. A common backstory for a professional apologist or an apologetics enthusiast is that they began to doubt their faith as they got older or more educated, feared they'd lose their faith, especially their sense of belonging, and sought out ways to reinforce it. Alternatively, a loved one may have left the faith, so the Christian, unable to coerce that loved one into engaging in ritual or affiliating with their faith community, sought out ways to argue their loved one back into belief. For these Christians, I won't deny that arguments for their faith are important to them. I do not, however, believe that they are necessary to their faith most of the time. After all, as many apologists will openly say, if they did not have such arguments, they would still be Christian. This should tell us that their belief is reinforced elsewhere, likely by behavior and belonging. What does engaging with these arguments accomplish? We must understand then that when we non-Christians engage with Christians on arguments for God or Christianity, we are not dealing with the foundation of their faith. We should not typically expect to change a person's belief, much less their faith position, through argument. In fact, I'd make the case that in certain scenarios, engaging with such arguments, even in a way which successfully undermines those arguments, serves to strengthen their faith and obfuscate its true basis. Say a Christian and a non-Christian hold a public debate about the moral nature of God. The Christian brings out sophisticated philosophical arguments, the non-Christian engages with them, points are won and lost on either side, but the non-Christian comes out ahead in the end. This is still an overall victory for the Christian, as their goals were well served even though they lost. The outcome of the debate on the philosophical reasons for belief is largely inconsequential to that belief. However, the outsider engaging with such arguments as if they are consequential to that belief tacitly endorses the idea that Christian belief is based on some rational line of thought, rather than founded in belonging and reinforced through behavior. Consider this statement from apologist William Lane Craig.
First of all, I think that I would tell them that they need to understand the proper relationship between faith and reason. And my view here is that the way in which I know Christianity is true is first and foremost on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart. And that this gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing that Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. And therefore, if in some historically contingent circumstances the evidence that I have available to me should turn against Christianity, I don't think that that controverts the witness of the Holy Spirit. In such a situation, I should regard that as simply a result of the contingent circumstances that I'm in, and that if I were to pursue this with due diligence and with time, I would discover that in fact the evidence, if I could get the correct picture, would support exactly what the witness of the Holy Spirit tells me. So I think that's very important to get the relationship between faith and reason right. Otherwise, what that means is that our faith is dependent upon the shifting sands of evidence and argument which change from person to person, place to place, and generation to generation. Whereas the Holy Spirit and His testimony gives every generation and every person immediate access to a knowledge of God and the truth of Christianity that's independent of the shifting sands of time and place and person and historical contingency.
This thinking fits into my model perfectly. Even for a philosopher like Craig, belief is not founded in reason or logical argumentation. Such argumentation is an additional but still unnecessary reinforcement of his belief. It is a secondary warrant, if belonging and behavior are the primary warrant. When debating him, Craig's interlocutor is never interacting with the basis for his belief, only his secondary warrant. Assuming most of Craig's Christian audience is like Craig in this way, and I believe they are, their belief, much less their faith, is not liable to change regardless of the result of the debate. This makes debating arguments for God or Christianity almost risk-free for the Christian, but still holds potential to reinforce their secondary warrant if they do well in the debate. It also creates the illusion, especially to outsiders, that Christian faith is based on reason, since the Christian debater seems practiced in argumentation. Christian debates, logical argumentation, and apologetics serve primarily as a PR campaign for Christianity. They strengthen Christians' secondary warrant, while, for non-Christians, they advertise Christianity as ultimately concerned with reason and logic, despite what they may have observed elsewhere. Does this mean there is no use in engaging with arguments for Christianity? Well, despite the fact that this view has made me quite uninterested in engaging in public debates, specifically myself, I wouldn't go that far. My friend Alex of Cosmic Skeptic is constantly engaging in these debates, so I decided to reach out and ask him why. Do you think that for most people, Christian belief is based in reasoning and argumentation?
No. It's not the case for most people that any form of religious belief, I would say, is based in argument or reason. Some people will claim that that is the case. There are some high-profile conversions like Anthony Flew, who at least claims that he was moved by reason to adopt Christianity. But I think that people who do make such a change represent a vanishingly small minority of people who just happen to be Christian, for example. Being billions of them, the vast majority of them, I think, are going to have a more confessional, emotional relationship with God than a rational one.
If that's the case, if people are not making the decision to believe based on these arguments, on reason, why debate these things, especially so publicly with Christians?
That's a very good question. And I think the reason why I like to participate in these debates is for a few reasons. One is that I like to prove that I'm actually doing the heavy lifting. Because although most people, I think, who believe the Christian theism is true, will, in my estimation, believe so mostly on something like the witness of the Holy Spirit, or they'll have some kind of personal religious experience that actually motivates the conversion. If you're having a conversation with them and you say that you don't believe what they're saying, they're not going to use that to try to convert you as much as saying, well, you need to read up on these arguments, you need to understand that there's good historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and this kind of thing. And so even though I'm a bit suspicious as to whether this is the area where I would have my mind changed, one benefit is that I'm able to say, look, I have considered these arguments. So at least ostensibly, if you're claiming that there are arguments for God's existence that should change a rational person's mind, I can say, well, look, I have considered them and they haven't done it. So what's next? That's one reason of doing it. Another reason is because from a theistic perspective, even if argumentation is not the motivating factor in causing a conversion, it might be an instance of legitimization. It might be an opportunity to intellectually legitimize a belief that came about through an irrational process. I think where arguments in religious philosophy really shine is in helping to legitimize a person's prior experience. If they've had some kind of experience of Christianity, Jesus comes to them in a dream or something, and they become totally convinced that Christianity is true, but they feel like they've got an intellectual gap that they can't justify to themselves, they can use argument and reason as a tool to help them get over that. Now, that sounds a little bit unfair maybe to them, but this is something, for example, that Alvin Plantinga has said about his own argument. The modal ontological argument is one of the most popular arguments discussed in religious philosophy. But Plantinga says himself that the reason this argument is useful is not to convince an atheist that God exists, but rather for somebody who already believes that God exists, just to prove that it's rational to believe so. It's not supposed to have any motivating force in terms of changing somebody's mind. It's just supposed to be a tool that somebody who already believes in God can use to ground their belief in something that can be called rational. So, if you read Plantinga's argument from the horse's mouth, as it were, then you'll find that, look, it's not an insult to say that these arguments don't move people to belief in God. It's not even what they're designed for.
Okay, now I have a little bit of a charge for you.
Sure.
How would you respond to the charge that debating a Christian publicly tacitly endorses the idea that Christian faith is contingent on having reasons or arguments for its truth?
I can see why you might think you've caught me out there, Drew, because, of course, here I am extolling the virtue of religious experience and entering into various communities and living life rather than sitting in your books. But then, what is my profession after all? The way that I see this is I think, look, I'm highly suspicious of the claim that I'm going to be convinced of God's existence by some form of syllogism. I think that if God is lurking somewhere to be discovered, it might be in a meaningful experience, it might be in a piece of poetry, it might be in whatever makes music beautiful, it might be in the basis of aesthetic. It's not going to be at the bottom of a microscope. Seems like a weird place for God to finally place the evidence of his existence. But if somebody comes to me and says, well, look, you're wrong about that. I have an argument that should convince any rational person, I think bring it on. I'm a philosopher before I'm an atheist. I think to myself, I'm interested in philosophical questions. I'm interested in questions of knowledge and epistemology and the questions of the philosophical foundations of science and ethics and these kinds of things. And philosophy of religion is just one of these things that I think is just fun. I think it's interesting. I don't think it's going to convince me. But somebody approaches me, sends me an email and says, well, hey, guess what? I'm going to change your mind and I'm going to do it in front of an audience. I think, fine. I go into that room not expecting that this is even the area in which my mind is likely to be changed. But of course, I have to be open to it in order to accept the debate. Otherwise, what's the point? But I think to myself, look, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I don't want people to think that because I haven't found a good argument for God's existence, I think that theism is therefore off the table for me. I think that religious experience is a perfectly legitimate way to come to belief in God. It's just not one that you can share with other people. It's by nature private. And so when somebody says that they want to stand in a public forum and talk to me in such a way that they think is going to convince me, I think that sounds astonishing to me, and I would love to see what they've got on offer. So that's why I do it. I think it's interesting. I think it's a bold claim that somebody's going to manage to convince me, despite the wealth of religious history, of famous conversions due to religious experience. They're going to convince me by putting a syllogism on a piece of paper. I think I've just got to see it.
All right, that is definitely the perspective I wanted to get before I continued with this video, so I appreciate you chatting with me.
Of course, man. Anytime.
I think Alex does make some good points here. Obviously, I've spoken about arguments for God in my videos many times, and I don't regret doing so. There are good reasons to speak about these arguments, and I don't mean to say that they're wholly irrelevant to belief, just that they're rarely central to it. That said, if you can think of any additional reasons to address these arguments, let me know in the comments, and I'd be very happy to hear them. What undermines Christian faith? If my model of Christian belief formation is accurate, it would predict that a Christian whose sense of belonging is weakened or lost is more likely to leave the faith than one whose secondary warrant for belief is lost. It would also predict that continued interruption of behavior, rituals like worship, devotional times, prayer, and the like, would undermine faith more significantly as well. When certain Christians say things like, "I've been publicly debating with non-believers for years and years, and my faith is still just as strong as ever," I can't help but think, sure, but you probably belong to a Christian community. Your family probably considers Christianity a must. You probably engage in emotionally powerful rituals like worship on a weekly basis, and other rituals like prayer and devotional times almost daily. Of course, you still believe. That's just to be expected if you act as a Christian all the time. Now, I'm not in the business of wholly destroying Christianity or convincing all Christians to leave the faith. So I've never issued some kind of public challenge like disengage from Christian community and ritual for a year and see what happens. What I am very interested in is revealing how Christian practices and institutions in many contexts can perpetuate religious harm. This is why I've produced videos about how groupish thinking can cause widespread harm, especially when Christians codify it into doctrine. This is why I've addressed how Christian worship serves to create conformity in the church, and even creates the opportunity for worshipers to mistake the will of the church leadership for the will of God. This is why I've spoken so extensively about my life as a Christian and how my environment was so carefully designed to keep me from seeing the religious harm it caused. Having done this, though, I've struck the faith of many in a place that I think hurts more than a solid counter to an argument for God. In their sense of belonging and their confidence in their rituals, their primary warrant for belief. This is of course anecdotal, but I've received far more vitriol from Christians in response to my discussion of systemic religious harm, the psychology of spiritual experience, and my own apostasy than I've ever received in response to counters to popular apologetics. This is what happens when you threaten the primary warrant of Christian faith, even if you don't mean to destroy that faith. So, arguing about the philosophy of Christianity can be fun and can serve a purpose, but if one wants to mitigate religious harm more substantially, they must address the faith's actual source of power, its creation of behavior and belonging. Failing to address those aspects of the faith for the sake of engaging only in philosophical arguments means treating as crucial an aspect of faith that is largely unimportant. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. Thanks again to Cosmic Skeptic for giving his perspective here. Alex and I spoke a bit more than I included here, so if you'd like to see our full conversation, you can access it over on my Patreon for just $1 a month. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.